Welcome everyone. In this lecture, we will discuss the article Green Defaults, Information Presentation, and Pro-Environmental Behavior, written by Daniel Pickert and Konstantinos Katsikopoulos. We will briefly introduce the topic and then talk about the method, the results and conclusion, and lastly provide some implications. The severe consequences of unsustainable energy consumption is growing as we rely on depletable resources like fossil fuels, which have serious negative outcomes. Therefore, many policies have been developed in order to promote the usage of renewable sources of energy like water, wind, biomass, sun, etc. Besides, with the liberalization of energy markets, the majority of European consumers became able to select their electricity supplier, given the chance to choose green electricity, and being informed about the origins of the alternatives through labels. The main goal of these efforts was to increase the usage of green energy, which as a result will decrease the consumption of fuels that are harmful for the environment. Indeed, governmental actions work pretty well. Several analyses in UK, USA, and EU found out that green energy is highly supported. Between 50 to 90% of the respondents indicated that they prefer green energy and they wouldn't mind to pay extra to have it. However, when the percentages of green energy consumption in those countries were considered, for example, 1% in Ireland, 0.4% in Finland, 1% in Germany, 2% in Switzerland, and 0.5% in the United Kingdom, it's notable that the preference for green power doesn't reflect behavior. How can this be explained? Previous research majorly focused on the personal factors like socio-demographic variables and attitudes about the natural environment to explain why people don't buy green energy although they prefer it. Different from the other approaches, this paper examines the psychological environment of a person that influences the decision to buy green electricity. Besides, psychological environment provides a more accurate measurement of decision-making characteristics. Format of the information presented is one of the most important components of the psychological environment. In general, companies tend to represent green and gray electricity in different formats, where gray electricity is a default option, that means customer has this option without doing anything, and green electricity as an alternative option, in other words, customer needs to switch it in order to have it. An interesting study regarding defaults about the concentrates for organ donation demonstrated that the countries which have opt-in policy, that means one has to register to become an organ donor, have dramatically less organ donors, like in Germany, 12%, than the countries who have opt-out policy, where one is donor unless one registers not to be a donor, like Austria, 99%. Also, it was found that when consumers have little familiarity with a product, defaults have stronger effects, which fits very well to the case of electricity since it's an intangible product. It's important to understand how defaults can affect decisions. Research on decision-making demonstrated that people are more likely to stick to defaults, in other words, they hardly ever switch to other alternatives. There are several explanations about why defaults have an impact on decisions. One of the explanations relates to rationality, since sticking with a default can save time, effort, and money. As a consequence, it can be considered rational. From another point of view, defaults might be perceived as a suggestion from an authority presenting a socially desired behavior. A default standard product offered by a company might be perceived by the customers as the best fit product for a majority of customers of this company. One can also avoid stressful and awkward decisions which require trade-offs and balancing conflicting objectives like saving money and preserving environment by simply sticking to the default option. Last but not least, it has been known that people like to develop habits since the word customer comes from custom. In short, considering the strong impact of defaults on decision and behavior, the following hypothesis was developed. Defaults affect the choice of electricity. Thus, currently most people use gray electricity because gray electricity is usually the default. In those cases where green electricity is a default, most people will use green electricity.
In order to find out whether the use of a green default actually makes people choose green electricity in a natural setting, two real cases were examined in the first step. Schönau is a small town with about 2,500 inhabitants in southern Germany. When the nuclear disaster in Chernobyl happened in 1986, a group of citizens decided to join forces and promote the use of green energy. They presented the local council with an offer for a sustainable energy supply, which however was rejected. The issue triggered intense discussion and conflicts among the population. As a result, in 1991, a referendum took place in order to decide who was going to take over the city's energy supply, which the citizens' initiative could just win with 52%. Finally, in 1997, the initiative acquired the ownership of the city's power grid, becoming the incumbent utility in Schönau. From the citizens' initiative, the Schönau Power Company, the EWS, emerged. To this day, it obtains energy exclusively from renewable resources, such as solar and wind energy. In 1998, 1 year later, the German electricity market was opened, which meant that citizens no longer had to use the EWS, but could now select other electricity suppliers and purchase grey electricity as well. In order to find out whether the green default would lead the majority of citizens to remain with green electricity, it was examined how many people in Schönau were still buying green electricity in 2006, 8 years later. In a second natural experiment, the Southern German electricity company Energiedienst GmbH was looked at. In 1999, the company, which previously had only one tariff, replaced it by a range of 3 new tariffs. In order to inform its 150,000 customers about the new options, letters were sent to them. A green tariff served as a default and was slightly cheaper than the previous tariff. Customers who opted for it did not have to respond to the letter and automatically received this tariff. The other 2 options were a grey tariff, which was 8% cheaper than the green one, and another green one, which was 23% more expensive, but included an even larger proportion of renewable energy. If customers preferred one of these 2 tariffs, they had to reply to the letter. It was analyzed how many customers stayed with the default.
So, what did the authors find? The first natural experiment was about the changing energy supply in Schönau, which showed that when green electricity has become the default, nearly every customer remained with the green electricity. 99.2% of the residents stayed with the green default. As you might remember, the average use of the green electricity in German towns is approximately 1%. In the second natural experiment, 3 electricity options were provided, with green electricity as a default. Over 94% of the customers stayed with the default, which was the green electricity. These results show that the format in which the information is presented has a big effect on the choices people make. However, these natural experiments have some limitations. For example, in the first natural experiment, not every customer might have known that they had a choice. There could also have been an effect of the heated debate in Schönau on the takeover in 1991. Also, the targeted customers of both these experiments had above average salary. Finally, we do not have any data from other suppliers to compare these results with. These limitations could have affected the outcomes of these experiments.
To control for confounding variables and to address the limitations that might have influenced the findings in the natural experiments, 2 laboratory experiments were carried out. The first one used a 1x3 between subjects design and involved 225 participants, with a mean age of 25. Only participants between 18 and 35 years of age were included because they are better able to gather information about energy supplies, especially online, and tend to move more frequently. Participants were randomly assigned to 3 conditions: green default, grey default, or neutral. First, they were instructed to imagine that they had moved to another city and received a letter from an electricity supplier that introduced itself as responsible for the basic electricity supply in this residential area, and then welcomed them as their new customer. A few days later, they were sent a contract. Then they had to imagine that weeks later they received a flyer from another electricity supplier, advertising their offers and saying, "Did you know that you can easily switch?" In the green default option, the letter was sent by the green utility, representing the incumbent utility, and the flyer was sent by the gray utility, representing the competitor. In the gray condition, it was the other way around, and in the neutral condition, information about both suppliers was provided equally and at the same time. In a 5-minute questionnaire, participants indicated whether they wanted to stay with the first provider or change to the second one, and gave reasons for their decision. They also assessed both companies in terms of their environmental and pricing policy on 7-point scales, which served as a manipulation check. Finally, they ranked the criteria reputation, environmental impact, location, service quality, and price according to their relevance during their decision-making process.
What did they find? In the green condition, 68% chose the green option. In the gray condition, 41% chose the green option, and in the neutral condition, 67% chose the green option. These results show that people are more likely to choose green electricity when it is presented as a default, compared to when it is presented as an alternative. The majority of the participants stated that the price, the environment, or both motivated their choice. There were no differences found in statements among the different conditions. Participants who felt distrust, skepticism, or complaints about insufficient information referred more to alternative options. However, there were only a few participants who felt the need that the default option needed to be assessed. An explanation for this could be that customers see the default as some kind of recommendation established by authority.
The second laboratory experiment used a 1x2 between subjects design and investigated the endowment effect. The endowment effect says that people tend to value a good more when they own it. Two central concepts are the willingness to pay and the willingness to accept. Behavioral economics have found that people tend to demand more money to give up a good than they are willing to pay to acquire it, which means that the willingness to accept is usually larger than the willingness to pay. Accordingly, the authors expected that the willingness to accept for green energy when already owning it will be greater than the willingness to pay for it when still owning grey electricity. 88 participants, also 25 years of age on average, completed a questionnaire. Because in the first experiment participants criticized the lack of information, participants were now first provided some general information about conventional and renewable energy. In the willingness to pay condition, participants were asked to imagine that they live in a city whose inhabitants are supplied with conventional, grey energy. However, it would be their own decision whether they would prefer to switch to green energy instead. Then they were asked if they would like to switch, and if so, how much they would be willing to pay extra per month. The willingness to accept condition differed in that participants were asked to indicate how much cheaper the grey tariff would at least have to be, which means how much money they would demand to give up green electricity.
The results show that participants in the willingness to pay condition wanted to pay €6.59 to switch to green electricity. Participants in the willingness to accept condition demanded €13 to switch to grey electricity. However, it should be noted that 43% of the participants in the willingness to accept condition were not willing to accept any compensation for switching. Therefore, they were not included in the willingness to accept and willingness to pay comparison. In the willingness to pay condition, 22% of the participants refused to switch. Therefore, only 57% of the participants were included in the analysis. These results show that participants were willing to pay only a small amount more for green electricity, However, they demanded more money to compensate for giving up the green electricity. This supports the expectation that the willingness to accept is bigger than the willingness to pay. Statements about the environment and about price differences were mostly made. However, there were no differences between conditions. These experiments tried to overcome the limitations from the natural experiments. However, these laboratory experiments brought up some other limitations. For example, the participants might not face this issue in real life, and therefore it might be hard for them to envision the situation. Also, the experiments did not have any consequences, which is actually the case in real life. There might also be the influence of social norms when choosing the electricity. These limitations could have influenced the results. So what can we conclude? This study shows that establishing a green default could result in more customers buying green electricity. With this finding, the hypothesis has been supported. Defaults affect the choice of electricity. Thus, currently, most people use grey electricity because grey electricity is usually the default. In those cases where green electricity is a default, most people will use green electricity. However, there are some technical issues and limitations of the default effect. It is possible that there is not enough green electricity to provide it for everybody. Thus, a green electricity default might not be possible. Also, the price differences between green and grey energy might be too big. This could influence the effect of the default. There are also some ethical issues in policymakers changing the default, as they may be seen as manipulators. So, when taking these issues into account, the manipulation of the green default actually might cause less excitement than expected. However, in general, we can conclude from this study that establishing a default option increases the amount of people choosing it. What are examples of defaults? An example of a default many people might know is a default you see in cafes and takeaways. When you order a coffee and you don't specify the size, you will receive the medium size. In this case, the medium is a default. Another example of a default is a default setting on your new phone. When you turn on your phone for the first time, multiple apps are already installed. You would have to actively delete them and install new ones. In general, companies offer standard packages for their customers, for example, insurances. These companies visualize these packages accordingly, so that when customers have a lack of information or a lack of time, they will choose for the default option. Goals for defaults could be increasing the company's profit, stimulating pro-environmental or healthy behavior, and decreasing of costs.
More people around the world are overweight than ever before, and not a single country is succeeding in tackling the problem.
Two studies out today that draw the same disturbing conclusion. Americans are not winning their battle against obesity. One study found that obesity rates for adults actually rose in 28 states this year. Only the District of Columbia showed a decline. So why is it that Americans keep getting fatter in spite of government efforts ranging from calorie posting to new school lunch programs?
As you heard in the videos you just saw, over the last few years, people have been getting fatter due to unhealthy eating, overeating, and general unhealthy behavior. And the number of unhealthy people is still increasing. This will lead to a higher number of deaths and higher healthcare costs in the future. There have been some interventions to try and increase healthy eating instead of unhealthy eating, and thus improve people's health. However, these have not been very successful. These interventions are usually based on people making informed choices. For example, information campaigns about unhealthy and healthy foods. These are usually not very successful because usually those changes are not sustained. This is because most food decisions are not made consciously. So people do not think of all the information that they have been given, for example, about what is healthy and what is not healthy, when they make a decision on what to eat.
What he finds is jaw-dropping. We are a nation of mindless eaters. Much of what we eat, and especially how much we eat, ends up being determined by what's around us. Two of the biggest influences on us end up being visibility and convenience. And there's nothing to stop us from reaching out, grabbing something, and eating something. We'll continue to do so till something tells us to stop.
This is where nudging comes into play. Nudging does not require any deliberate thinking or effort for processing, instead relying on subtle changes to facilitate making a healthy choice. This means, for example, making a healthier choice easier to grab or more visually attractive. This is based on a dual process model of behavior. On the one hand, we have System 1, which is a fast process. It occurs by default and effortlessly. This might be described as like an impulsive choice. System 2, on the other hand, is used when more deliberate thinking is required. Most daily decisions are made with System 1. What's also important to note is that System 2 requires effort. This means that various things undermine System 2 processing, things like being distracted, feeling hungry, and also already having exercised self-control. So if you have made like a difficult choice before, the choices afterwards, you're more likely to just use System 1, so quickly decide. And as you can imagine, most of these things are acting up when choosing foods, because you're very likely hungry. Usually when you're standing in a supermarket or when you're standing in a canteen, there are things that are distracting you, maybe you're not on your own. So this can also lead to you making System 1 choices, which are usually unhealthier choices. In the article, 3 types of nudging are tested in the environment of a public canteen. The first one is accessibility. Accessibility means that you're more likely to choose something which is closer or in proximity or easier to reach, compared to something that's further away, for which you have to put in more effort. This means that repositioning can lead to different choices being made, and in this way, healthier choices can be promoted. So if, for example, fruits are put closer in proximity than unhealthy chocolates, for example, that will mean that people choose fruits more than chocolate, relatively more. The second one is salience. People have a natural tendency to approach things that they find rewarding, so things that are looking good or that they know are rewarding. So a second way of nudging people can be to make the healthy choices visually more appealing compared to unhealthy choices. If you compare this to smoking, for example, in smoking there is this process going on of making packaging less visually attractive in the hopes of reducing smoking. Finally, there's the social proof nudge, which you can compare to, for example, some booking site telling you 10 others have chosen this product. So this is because food choices of others often have strong influence on people's own consumption choices. So people can be influenced by what people have chosen before them. So by making fruits, for example, by putting a sign next to it saying best-selling choice, people might be more likely to choose the fruits or other healthy foods. Finally, in this article, they also wanted to test whether making all these nudges transparent would lead to a decrease or maybe an increase in effectivity. So they wanted to test whether if people knew that there were nudges being used, whether this would influence how effective those nudges were.
Moving on to the method section. This study took place at a takeaway food vendor in a large academic hospital in the Netherlands. The takeaway food vendor sold a variety of hot and cold beverages like coffee, tea, fruit juices, soft drinks, etc. They also sold small meal items like salad, bread rolls, sandwiches and other baked goods, and snacks like yogurt, cookies, fruits, etc. Participants consisted of all customers who made purchases at the takeaway food vendor. Most of the customers were hospital personnel because patients did not buy much at the takeaway food vendor. This field experiment lasted for 7 weeks. This study used 3 different nudges for the sales of fruits, healthy bread rolls, and yogurt shakes. The accessibility nudge was used to promote the sales of fruits. The salience nudge was used to promote the sales of healthy bread rolls, and the social proof nudge was used to promote the sales of yogurt shakes. The first week of 7 was a baseline week where no nudges were implemented. The second week was an experimental nudge week where all 3 nudges were simultaneously implemented but still targeting different healthy food choices. Weeks 3, 4 and 5 were washout weeks where all 3 nudges were simultaneously removed to prevent carryover effects from the previous nudge week. The last week was an experimental nudge week where again all 3 nudges were simultaneously implemented. Only this time an additional disclosure slogan was implemented as well to convey the purpose of the nudge. All purchases were recorded electronically for every week. The procedure went as followed. In both the experimental weeks, the nudge week and the nudge disclosure week, all 3 nudges were set up simultaneously at 7:30 a.m. on Monday morning at the time the food vendor opened. They were removed at 5 p.m. on Friday afternoon at the time the food vendor closed. During the nudge and disclosure week, a sign of the disclosure informing the purpose of the nudge was displayed for each nudge. After the 7-week experiment, the manager of the food vendor provided the electronically recorded sales to the researchers. Moving on to the materials, the accessibility nudge was implemented as followed. During the baseline week, the fruits were placed behind the counter at the back of the takeaway food vendor and were out of reach for customers. This can be seen in Figure 1a within the blue circles. In Figure 1b, the nudge week is presented. Here, the fruits are presented at the front counter, where customers had direct physical access to the fruits. This is what the accessibility nudge implied, removing a physical barrier to make fruits easier to access and thereby promoting the sales of these fruits. In the baseline week of the salience nudge, bread rolls with muesli were placed together with the croissants in one container and the bread rolls with currants were placed together with cheese croissants in another container. This is seen again in Figure 1a within the red circle. The salience nudge implemented in the nudge week was intended to draw attention to the healthy bread rolls. This was done by placing the bread rolls together and the croissants together. Furthermore, the bread rolls were placed in green checkered cloth with a picture of wheat fields behind it to enhance the salience and presentation of the bread rolls. This is seen in Figure 1b within the red circle. Third, during the baseline week of the social proof nudge, the labels of the 3 different yogurt shakes, yogurt bowl, yogurt cup and yogurt shake, were placed flat on the counter. Customers do not notice the labels unless they approach the counter, as seen in Figure 2a. The social proof nudge was intended to promote the yogurt shake by stating that it was the preferred choice by the majority of customers. To implement this nudge, the labels for the 3 yogurt options were redesigned. First, pictures of fruit, muesli, and containers were added to accompany the text to visualize how the 3 yogurt options were different from each other. Second, the labels were placed on the wall in clear view. Critically, on the label for the yogurt shake, an additional tagline, best-selling choice, was included to trigger a descriptive norm, thereby providing a social proof heuristic for customers. Last, to implement the nudge disclosure, a sign with a simple message, "We help you make healthy choices," was displayed on each individual nudge during the nudge and disclosure week to reveal the actual intention of the nudges. Moving on to the data processing and analysis, the data collected is only descriptive in nature because only total sales of the products are collected and not individual sales. Therefore, means and standard deviations could not be calculated and no significance test could be carried out to calculate differences in sales. Nonetheless, chi-square analysis were carried out to compare the sales of the healthy food choices to the unhealthy food choices during the baseline week, the nudge week, and the nudge and disclosure week. Also, exploratory analysis investigated if there were any spillover effects of the nudges during the washout weeks. Moving on to the results section, the accessibility nudge had the following results. In Table 1 it can be seen that in the nudge week the sales of fruits increased with 73.3% compared to the baseline week. Compared to the baseline week, fruit sales increased with 82.2% during the nudge and disclosure week, and compared to the nudge week, fruit sales increased with 5.1%. Results from the follow-up pairwise comparisons revealed that the proportion of fruit sales to confectionery sales in the nudge week was significantly different to the proportion in the baseline week. In Table 2, results of the chi-square analysis is shown. The proportion of fruit sales to confectionery sales in the nudge and disclosure week was also significantly different to the proportion in the baseline week. Finally, the proportion of fruit sales to confectionery sales in the nudge week was not significantly different to the proportion in the nudge and disclosure week. In addition to the descriptives, the results from the chi-square analysis show that the accessibility nudge was effective in promoting fresh fruits. Next, the results of the salience nudge showed that during the nudge week an increase of 9.3% of sales of healthy bread rolls was found compared to the baseline week. During the nudge and disclosure week an increase of 12.4% was found compared to the baseline week and a 2.8% increase compared to the nudge week. Results from the chi-square analysis did not find any significant differences in any of the weeks, even though the descriptive might suggest it. This is seen in Table 3 and 4. Therefore, the salience nudge has not been effective. Descriptives of the social proof nudge showed that there was only a difference of 1 in sales between the different weeks. For this reason, no further analysis was carried out and the social proof nudge has not been effective. Last, results of the exploratory analysis suggested that there is a potential spillover effect of the accessibility nudge. There was a significant difference between the baseline week and the washout weeks, and no significant differences between the washout weeks, the nudge week, and the nudge and disclosure week. This demonstrates a sustained increase in fruit sales during the washout weeks.
Sometimes, all that people need is just a nudge into the right direction. According to the research, it can be stated that the accessibility nudge was a particularly effective nudge in this study. Consistent with previous research, simply moving healthy foods to a more convenient place led to a significantly higher amount of healthy foods sold. However, during the control weeks after the accessibility nudge, where the healthy foods were not as accessible anymore, it was found that the healthy foods were sold at the same rate as during the accessibility nudge period. So, the effect might have spilled over to the subsequent weeks. Future research should be conducted to rule out the potential confounding factors that facilitated this spilling over effect. The salience nudge was intended to enhance the visibility and visual attractiveness of the healthy bread rolls. The observed increase in sales of the healthy bread rolls was, however, not significant across the 3 weeks. Nonetheless, these findings do not necessarily dismiss the effectiveness of a salience nudge in general. It may be the case that the influence of the salience nudge was overpowered by consumers' existing preferences and habits for bread purchases. Having said that, it would be interesting for future research to examine the extent of influence of the nudges in the presence of existing preferences and habits. Lastly, it should be once again acknowledged that the low sales of yogurt shakes across the entire 7-week period did not warrant statistical analysis that would be sufficiently powered to examine the effects of the social proof nudge. The social proof nudge is therefore a viable area of interest for future research. Keep in mind that, due to practical reasons, all 3 nudges were implemented simultaneously in the current study. Future research could potentially examine whether presenting multiple nudges together would cause interference between the nudges, or whether they could complement each other and have additive effects. The current study also examined the impact of disclosure. The findings indicated that disclosing the intended purpose of the nudge did not interfere with its effects, which is in line with recent research. There were also no reactance effects observed. This meant that disclosing that the nudge was meant to help consumers make healthy choices did not result in compensation effects or a decrease in the purchasing of unhealthy products. However, in the study, only the intended purpose of the nudge was disclosed and not the actual presence of the nudge. Future research should further determine whether this effect holds when consumers are made aware of the actual presence of the nudge, and should take into consideration whether consumers actually read the disclosure message. This point is especially important in relationship to ethics regarding nudges, because, according to the House of Lords Behavior Change Report, interventions are ethical depending on the extent to which it is covert. Other limitations of the research were the fact that it was a field study, which does not allow for a lot of control, and the fact that food choice does not necessarily mean food consumption. To conclude, This research has demonstrated nudging to be a low-cost and easy-to-implement strategy to promote healthy food choices. Nowadays, with the increasing trend of people eating outside their homes, public eating environments have been identified as strategic places for health promotion, and nudging presents itself to be a promising strategy to deliver results in these environments.